Hello everybody, it's Legion, and today we're going to be grading the Rebel Corps. So, just to kind of start off, Rebel players, I'm sorry. I think you guys, and especially your core troopers, were hit indirectly by a lot of the nerfs to vigilance and dodges and things like that. So I always have a lot of friends that have been Rebel players, and I get a lot of experience playing against them, and especially seeing their reactions and their opinions on the most recent errata to their faction and kind of how it affected them, even though not a single unit got a points change. So let's dive deeper into this. I think that they're in an interesting spot, and I think there's a lot to talk about. So once again, this is how I grade the units, so feel free to stop and kind of get a better understanding of how I do this. Let's start off with the Fleet Troopers coming in at 40 points. They are 1 health apiece, Courage 1. They have the Ready keyword, giving them an aim after they take a standby. They search to hit, search to defend on white dice, 2 white at range 2, and black in melee. These guys can be good as an objective unit, and they also have a decent range 2 pull, especially once we look at their heavies and kind of see how they can add to that. But I really just think these guys have become somewhat irrelevant, especially in the current game state of things like armor, dark troopers teleporting to your back objective, a lot of the older objectives becoming less relevant in terms of things like, hey, I want to play sabotage. Maybe not. So I just feel like Rebel Troopers can do the same thing as well. Even vets, even snipers. Like, okay, I need someone to hold my back, intercept the transmission. You might as well just have a sniper that's going to range 3, aim and shoot, and range 5 and plink off a unit every turn. I remember when I first came into the game, this was a very prominent Rebel strategy. Is like, I'm just going to have a cheap unit of Rebel Fleet Troopers, put them on my back objective, get that box, whatever it is, that's their role. And I think that that's still fine, and that's nothing against this unit if that's what you're looking to do with the Fleet Troopers, and, you know, go pick up an objective, go on the payload, whatever it is, and take standbys every turn, completely fine. I think they're perfect for that. So if that's what you're looking to do, awesome. If we're looking at this unit as a whole and actually wanting to use them in the game and let them participate a little bit, I think they struggle tremendously. Especially being a range 2 unit, I think they're probably one of the worst options in the game, and they're just going to get outclassed by a majority of other things that are going to be smiling ear to ear. But the fact of a Rebel Trooper unit coming into range 2 of them, Force Users, Melee, other range 2 units, you name it. I just don't think Rebel Fleet Troopers can compete in that aspect. But we can look at their upgrades and kind of see the best way we can do this. So we have the Barrage Trooper, which I think is actually pretty interesting in the current meta, with a black and 2 white. It is exhaustible. Blast and Impact 2. Both of those things are actually really prominent in the terms of armor, Dark Troopers, things coming into play now, and then Blast with, you know, the cover situation we live in. That might actually be the better option than the more consistent and formidable aspect of the Scattergun Trooper. I've seen this one used a lot, especially Rebel players. Putting him in the bus, extra trooper, shotgun trooper, popping out of the bus, shooting at a unit. Very common. And the Pierce one just helps you guarantee some more hits, and 2 red dice is going to make your dice pool look a little bit better as well. And then, you know, honestly, a really cheap 7 points for another Rebel Trooper unit. Not a bad deal. I think that is the best way to play these guys if you are looking to play them. I think you can actually make the argument for the Barrage Trooper or the Scattergun Trooper, but you might as well put the extra Fleet Trooper on there as well, and put them in a bus and carry them to safety and let them come out and shoot something. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times in how many good units there are in the game now, these guys have just become extremely dated in terms of being able to hurt any type of unit as much as you're paying for them. Like, you put this 23 points in and then another 7 points in. They're not exactly expensive, but you are kind of setting up this situation with the bus to drop them off and have them do something really good. And maybe they can wipe out a full squad. But I can promise you next turn, if they are in range 2 of your whole army, like I would suspect they are, they're probably getting evaporated off the board. And that's kind of how I feel about Fleet Troopers. Is yes, they could hit hard, but the answer is could, if, should, when, how. How are you going to do that? Are you going to put another 75 points in for this unit in the bus to get there? I feel like these guys need a friend to necessarily do anything. I've even played a couple games recently where I had an opponent that was running like 4 Fleet Troopers, and it was just kind of like, a shooting gallery of watching him try to come into range to even get a shot off. And it's just like, okay, there's 5 fleet troopers dead that turn, 6 this turn, great. So unless you have some good terrain that's going to allow you to use line of sight blockers to move up and position yourself appropriately and get those standbys off, there's just so many units that outrange these guys, and they don't have the defensive properties to get into range 2. So, cool unit, nothing against them. I just really think they could use some love and appreciation. Moving on, we have the Herald of the Rebel community. So I know a lot of people are going to see a C-, and they're going to be like, all right, what? Like, Rebel Troopers were one of the best units in the game in terms of a specific setup, which we're going to talk about. But right now, 40 points. They have Nimble, 1 health, 1 courage, search defend on white dice, range 3 guns with black, and black and melee. They have Nimble. They're cheap. They do have a weapon upgrade pack, so they actually have a decent amount of weapons to choose from, and they have a meta setup. In other words, they have a really good combo of this, this, and this that makes the unit extremely good, which we're going to talk about, but unfortunately that setup has been nerfed pretty significantly. So cons, courage 1, I mean, same problem with the fleet troopers. It's like, it's just tough, especially for range 2 units, to have courage 1 and get a suppression and not be able to move and shoot. Same thing with the rebel troopers, being able to do something like take a dodge and shoot, maybe. Just not going to happen a lot of times because you are suppressed. I think these guys are relatively easy to kill. I mean, we all know what surging to defend on white dice does. And unfortunately, those dice can be very swingy. Sometimes you get a decent roll and save some, and other times you blank out 6 defensive rolls. And I feel like with Rebel Troopers, yes, they're still cheap, but when you're playing something like B1s, you understand the limited defense value of the dice, and unfortunately Rebel Troopers sit in that awkward medium. And so a lot of the ways that they negate that is through a variety of other things, like using their keyword Nimble and situational awareness and dodges, which we're going to talk about. But they don't surge to hit either, which is kind of tough. And honestly, in the history of Legion, these guys have really only ever had one setup that has been truly competitive. So the unit may have been overrated for a long time, and now that we see that setup kind of die off, these guys really aren't that great in my opinion. I would even argue that they could be something like a D-. But for their cost and how cheap they are, I think they're okay. But let's look at their upgrades. So the DLT 20A Trooper, very nice range 4 gun with critical 1. Easily think this is the best option out of the 4. It is more expensive, thus why we want better defense on these Rebel Troopers to kind of protect that heavy as long as possible. Ion Trooper, I really don't know how to feel about this thing. It's exhaustible, 2 red, great, impact 1, ion 1, awesome. Just always feels like a situational weapon when I'm running ion. But still cool, especially, like I said, armor is becoming more and more of a thing, but impact 1 really isn't that great because a lot of our armor now is seeing dodges and things like that. That's not even going to let you get that ion off, kind of making the gun useless. Especially since it's exhaustible, I just don't understand why you would take it. Same thing with the SX-21 Trooper, also has impact 1, 2 red and 2 white, range 2. It's not a bad dice pool to add on for 15 points by any means. Unfortunately, it is range 2, which is easily the biggest deterrent for me. But, I mean, hey, 15 points for another body isn't too bad. Z6 is honestly interesting to me for 20 points, but without surging and any real aim mechanics in the faction to make Rebel Troopers hit harder, 6 white dice isn't going to have a ton of impact, but it's just nice having that many more dice in your hand to essentially get another hit or crit in your dice pool. So probably interesting to see what that does, but range 3 isn't the greatest when you're talking about units that can fall apart very quickly, especially dumping 20 points in for that kind of a setup. So speaking of setup, let's talk about the setup. You have Rebel Troopers, 7 points. I don't even know why they exist at this point, because you could come over here on the right, and you could do a Rebel Trooper Specialist for 8 points. You can get a free dodge or surge token by activating that card. I would actually argue that's pretty decent upgrade in terms of what the Rebels are looking for right now. But this guy in the middle, Rebel Trooper Captain, allows you to ignore suppression and can't be suppressed during this activation, but you can't roll for your dice either in terms of removing suppression. This is a little unfortunate now because panic checks can sometimes for objectives be after a unit goes, so when you do that, you may already be panicked, like you have 4 suppression, your commander's courage 2, so technically you're panicked, you use this card to get onto the objective, and then you're panicked for after that unit goes, meaning that you can't score a certain objective, which can suck. So that's almost kind of a deterrence at this point, but it's still good, especially when you're only at 1 suppression and things like that. So by no means bad. The real key here is that you get a training slot. And so the combo was training slot on the captain, you get the DLT, and you put situational awareness on, because obviously they don't have a training slot to begin with. So all these things give you essentially triple cover. Use the dodge, situational awareness to dodge crits. You have heavy cover as much as possible, and you use the DLT to kind of stay in a range 4 area to use that critical one to do plink damage as much as possible. You usually have something like 2 officers or Leia with vigilance, and you would be inspiring units, you would be handing out dodges, and with vigilance, every Rebel Trooper unit would have dodges. And you can do this in a lot of lists. I know a lot of people are going to think, oh, Luke DLT gunline, but you could do this in Leia lists, you could do this in Lando list, Han list, like whoever. It was just a good option to have what felt like a truly elite Rebel Trooper unit. But now, situational awareness is 4 points, vigilance is 12 points, and even though these things aren't directly a part of the Rebel faction, it absolutely destroys that combo in terms of cost. I think it goes up by like a total of 14 points. 14 points per unit if you divide the vigilance by keeping 1 dodge on each trooper. So sure, you could do the math and like argue this or that, but nonetheless, if you're trying to run this setup that was once the godsend of the Rebel faction in terms of having good competitive core units, it's now a lot more expensive. And unfortunately, I think that expense is too much to the point that your opponent's actually going to focus on killing this unit. And while having the extra dodge and getting something like triple cover can be really good, there's plenty of dice pulls in the game that are going to get past that and just wipe out your unit, especially when they're trying to pressure you at range 3. So once a really great unit, I think it still is, but unfortunately Rebel Troopers as a whole, I think are a C-, if not worse. If not worse. Because I think that is the only competitive setup you can do, and unfortunately now it is even more expensive to do, and it requires a lot of different pieces outside of Rebel Troopers. It's not just the captain, the situational awareness, and the DLT. You also need vigilance, you also need your commanders, you also need other things to support that just for that to be a reality. So unfortunate, but I do think it's a big downfall of once what was a great staple in the competitive environment. So a little bit of a nerf in terms of the Rebel faction, for sure. Rebel Trooper Specialist is interesting to me because he gives you a dodge, just for free, essentially, as long as you have it unflipped. So, might be the better choice at this point. I could be wrong, but I really like the idea of just getting a dodge on a turn that you really need it. But nonetheless, Rebel Troopers have fallen from their former glory. And then we have the Rebel Vets. I keep a nice little album of every game I play. I like to take a picture, and I think I have a great amount of games on there at this point, but nonetheless, 1/3 of those games, or those pictures rather, have Rebel Vets in them. In other words, this is a unit I have played against the most, and have also played with a decent amount of times. Nonetheless though, I feel like I know this unit like the back of my hand, and I've seen every trick in the book when it comes to these guys and their emplacement troopers, the MK2s. But let's talk about them. I give them a C+. I think they're a little above average. I think if you're looking to play core for the purposes of them actually being in combat and not just filling out the 3 core slots that are required of you, I unfortunately think that this is your only true competitive option as a Rebel player. You could probably do some DLT situational awareness stuff with the Rebel Troopers, but if you're looking to have 6 core troopers on the board as a Rebel player, this might be the way to go now. Or at least a couple of these guys. Not for sure yet, but I really do think that Rebel Vets are the only one of these that makes sense to me at this point. But 1 health, 1 courage, surge to hit and to defend, range 3, black dice and melee. Defend 1 and coordinate 2 emplacement trooper. First off, detachment, MK2s, boom. Good combo, that's a pro. Great heavy. I think they have the best heavy that the Rebel Troopers have to offer at this point. They're a more elite Rebel core. Surge to hit as well. So even if you don't have the heavy, even if you already used your critical 2, we'll talk about that in a second, you still surge to hit, which is fantastic. Cons, they are costly. well, they're not too costly, but for rebels, they feel a little costly, especially when you start putting upgrades on them, extra troopers, things like that. They can die pretty quickly because they still surge to defend in melee. More importantly, they are order hungry, and a faction that is oftentimes looking for orders wherever they can get them. These guys absolutely want every single order they can get. Especially for the defend one, that's more of a minute detail, but giving them orders for emplacement troopers mostly is great. Unfortunately, I think the biggest deterrence of these guys is that they are Courage 1. I have seen so much value of a more elite rebel unit such as the Vets deterred due to the fact that they are Courage 1. Not saying they should be Courage 2, I'm just saying I feel like that is easily their biggest weakness besides the fact that they don't have the greatest defensive saves. But let's look at their stuff. So for 26 points, I think you have the best Rebel Heavy in the game right now, which is 4 white, critical 2, and range 4. This is a great gun. The only problem with it is simply goes with the Courage thing for the most part. I think you need to aim and shoot at range 4 to give you the best chance of getting your critical 2. If not, 3 crits, 1 natty, and 2 critical 2s. Like, whatever happens, happens. But a lot of times I've also seen this at range 4 where me and a good friend of mine or those people that I play all the time that play vets will take a pot shot at range 4, move up, shoot, and they'll just blank all 4 dice because they are white dice at the end of the day. Or better yet, they just get 1 natural hit. So you still need to roll a surge, you still need to roll a crit for this to really be effective, and I think with aims you give yourself the best chance. Unfortunately, Courage 1, a lot of times I feel like these guys are the first thing I try to suppress because I feel like I get a lot of value out of doing so. 9 points for an extra vet. I've also seen this a lot. A lot of my opponents will bring the extra veteran just for another body in terms of keeping these units alive, because you have to remember that most people are going to bring an MK2 for every squad they bring, meaning that you really only bring about 3 of these, yet things like Echo Base make me think that maybe there's a purpose for having more than just 3? I don't know. But nonetheless, I think it's a really good range 4 heavy. I think it's very solid, and in the world of armor, dodges, and permanent heavy cover, critical 2 is a welcome sight to see. Then we have the MK2. I give the MK2 a C-, and I feel like this is going to kind of throw people off because I'm, talking good about the vets, but there's some reasons why. So it's got fire support. It is a detachment, meaning you have to bring 1 rebel trooper, 1 rebel veteran for every MK2. In other words, 1 per 1. Don't have to bring rebel vets for every MK2. You can have 6 rebel vets if you want, but you need a unit of vets for an MK2. Okay, fire support, full pivot, reposition, sentinel, all great things. 4 health, 2 courage, surge to hit, and surge to defend. 1 black in melee. They have a blaster rifle for 1 black, and then they have a critical 2 range 3 gun, which is the turret blaster that is cumbersome and fixed front arc. So first off, let's go through the pros. Fire support. Rebels have a lot of pierce. They have a lot of keywords on their guns. Great unit that allows for so many fire support options and so many unique fire support options. Obviously, the clones are the fire support kings, but I will say that the Rebels in the MK2s are actually a pretty interesting combo. You can do things like Lando, Sharpshooter 2, Pierce 1. There's a lot of cool combos, okay? But they're very situational, and that's going to be my biggest thing. Number 2, they're critical 2. You can add critical 2 to a dice pool that maybe didn't have any surge to hit or crit, whatever it is, and that's great. It's great that they just naturally have critical 2. It's going to help the MK2 get shots off through heavy cover a lot more. It's going to allow you to hit armor, things like that. Sentinel, it is cumbersome, so yes, you can shoot then move, but for the most part, you're going to be moving and probably taking a standby if you're out of range of stuff, which is great, because I think that's something that the MK2s do well, is board control, especially with the Sentinel ability. Cumbersome changes, still good though. Shoot then move, there's going to be a lot of objective play with that, I believe. And then they're just cheap. 38 points for another unit, that's something the Rebels like, is cheap. So that, to me, is actually what makes the MK2s good at all, is the fact that they are only 38 points. Cons. Gets bullied. I know a lot of MK2 players are going to be like, no they don't. They're the first unit that I'm just like, yeah, I can kill that. Range 4, I feel like decimates these guys, deters their standbys, everything. I feel like anything beyond range 3 can absolutely kill these dudes because they only have 4 health. Sure, they can block and they can be annoying and they still have full value until they are dead. Like they're not losing shots for every model that's gone, it's just 1 model. But I do feel like they can get bullied very easily and very often. Snipers, range 4, anything that can outrange them. Especially since they have to shoot, then move. They can't move and shoot something. So that's tough. And they're slow. They're speed 1. They are an emplacement trooper, so it's not that bad of a thing. But I just think they're kind of easy to kill. Another thing is their silhouette is really tall now. And while that can absolutely help you in certain situations where you used to not be able to see anything, that also means I can see the MK2. Some of the best plays I've ever seen by MK2s is when they're hiding behind LOS blockers and they're just watching over an objective. They're taking standbys, they're forcing you to make tough decisions because you cannot get onto a certain point in the board. And they can still do that for the most part. But I do feel like in a lot of situations that board control dies very quickly with anyone that has any type of range in their army. So unfortunately that's a little situational. You could definitely go against another army that is range 3 based or melee based and you're going to be super excited because you're going to get to fire support out the wazoo, but there's going to be a lot more games when your opponent has something like 2 snipers, 4 range 4 heavies, whatever it is, and they're just going to kill these MK2s before they get to do a lot. Another thing is they kind of want orders, like you're not getting the fire support unless you are giving them an order. So that means that, once again, Rebel players, you are giving your orders to core troopers and not to your heroes, not to your operatives, things like that. Which isn't always bad, especially when that's when your list is supposed to be doing, but it's still something to think about is these MK2s need orders for the most part in terms of getting the true value out of them. I think that fire support is definitely what puts them in the competitive field. So one last thing about these guys is thinking about the vets and everything about them. They've definitely seen the most success in the Rebels in terms of Echo Base. We will talk about Echo Base specifically in another video, but I'm looking at Rebel vets and MK2s as a faction, like everything involved. Okay, so yes, I know that is probably the Rebels' most competitive choice right now is an Echo Base list with 3 MK2s and 3 vets. But I really only think the only reason that list works is because of the 3-pip hold at any cost. And we'll get there. We'll talk about it. But overall, I think this unit is a little below average in the grand scheme of things. And I think he's going to get beat up by a lot of stuff. But hold at any cost really brings up their value. So I know we've seen success there, but I do think the Rebels, for the most part, are struggling. So these are just generic upgrades that everyone can take. Do the Rebel Columns tech. You can do cool things like giving HQ uplink on the vets to give them an order and then coordinate to the MK2. Very cool combo, but it's 19 points to do that. Medical Droid, it's a non-combatant, 18 points, you can heal 2 things. Not too shabby. Astromech for 8 points, that's pretty freaking cheap to heal 2, but what armor do you have in your list as a Rebel player? Then Rebel Officer, it's a cool idea. Increasing your courage by 1, inspire 1 as well, not too bad at all. But for 16 points, I question the value, yet I would be interested to see someone use these guys more often. I just never really see it, and I think it's mostly because you're dumping too many points into a unit to get those basic principles. Summary. Weakest part of the Rebels? You tell me. I feel like the core units have once again taken their role in the Rebel faction as the last thing that you're looking to put into your list in terms of excitement or things that are going to win you games. Good options were nerfed indirectly. Once again, I think Rebel Troopers, situational awareness, the commanders, the DLTs easily was the best Rebel core option, and everything that went into that in terms of keeping dodges, getting dodges, upgrades, nerfed. So dodge spam has indirectly been hurt, and because of that, I think Rebels need them the most in terms of just remaining stable as a faction, not OP like some things like Pikes. But Battle Force, I feel like, really undermines the faction, and this is kind of just a side complaint. Like, Echo Base is the faction at this point in terms of the competitive scene, so I'm really excited for Rebel players to pull some crazy lists out of their butts and win anyways and defy all these things I've said. So please, somebody out there, do Han, Luke, Chewie, and win a tournament and make me happy, because I'm always rooting for the Rebels, because I definitely feel like they're the underdog right now. But Battle Force Echo Base, I feel like just completely undermines the faction. I have a lot of friends that play Rebels, and it seems like all of them are slowly shifting to, crap, I need to play Echo Base to compete at this month's tournament, which I feel like sucks. So, you tell me. Becoming old, Fleet Troopers, Rebel Troopers, some of these upgrades, I just feel like they're getting outdated, and for the most part, I think we could definitely see some erratas on certain upgrades and options to maybe validate something like an Ion Trooper on my Rebel Troopers. But I mean, they're already pretty cheap, so maybe we look at actually defining the keywords and what they actually do in the list. So, tomato, tomato, don't know. But for the most part, I feel like Fleet Troopers, especially, just completely outdated in terms of what they can provide on the table. Last but not least, when I first started playing Legion, it felt like the main thing that Rebel players were doing is like, I'm taking my 3 core, they're all naked, and then I'm taking special forces and everything else to make my list. I feel like that's happening again. I could be wrong. I definitely see people trying to make it work outside of Echo Base, but for the most part, it seems like I just got to get these troop choices out of the way, and then I'm going to play the stuff that I think is actually fun. Unfortunately, I think things like Wookiees that used to be a thing you would take is now also taking a hit with things like scale. So very, very different place for the Rebel faction in terms of what I've seen throughout my Legion career and the most recent dodge spam nerf and everything like that. I think Rebel players are kind of looking for lists right now to become competitive, and what they have found is that Echo Base is the answer, which is unfortunate because it's not really the faction, right? But it does have some units in there that the Rebel faction also has access to, which is all of them. It's just it doesn't have the card that makes it really good, but that's okay. So Rebel players, I know you're gonna maybe feel a little hurt by some of these rankings, but I do feel like this is the case, unfortunately, for the core units of this faction. And I do feel like this is what is holding the faction back the most in terms of being successful. But thankfully, as we've talked about before, they have the most commanders, they have some good operatives, and they've got some pretty decent stuff outside of the core units. But nonetheless, summary, Rebels got hit indirectly by the nerfs. So you guys keep doing it. As my good friend would say, as a Rebel player, you just gotta have hope, and that it doesn't matter how I grade these guys. But you guys have a great day. Keep commenting, subscribe, like, go check out Jerry's Game Shop. He's got some good battle reports. I should be on there a couple times now with some more videos up and coming. So you guys leave some changes, anything you'd like to see differently, anything you'd like to see, complaints, comments, concerns, things you disagree with. I love having those conversations and diving deeper into why I think the way I do. But you guys have a great one.